Bentornati. Incominciamo oggi pomeriggio con la nostra prima keynote che verrà fatta da Ross Mayfield, che è il fondatore e il presidente di Social Text, e ci parlerà dell'impatto del social software dentro le aziende. Ross?
Thanks, Paolo. Where do I go with this? Hello. Hi. My name is Ross Mayfield. I'm the chairman, president, and co-founder of Social Text. We make wikis for a living. But what I'll be doing today is not so much talking about wikis, because hopefully you understand a lot of it already, just by using Wikipedia or using wikis in your work. And instead what I'll talk about is trying to make software closer. Can you hear me? Yeah. Excellent. I'll be talking about social software. And the beautiful thing about social software, like a lot of other things, is there's no really good definition for what social software is, except for perhaps it's software that's made of people. And so what I'm going to explore with you a little bit, and hopefully leave time for questions if someone can prompt me, is that even enterprises, companies, happen to also be made of people. And that's something that we largely have forgotten along the way as we've been making enterprise software. What's interesting, actually, think about what traditional enterprise software is. It's top-down, highly structured, rigid tools, where you have rigid business rules, structured applications that we try to fit everything into to try to gain this illusion of control. And that makes a lot of sense when you're trying to automate business processes to drive down costs. But there's a lot more about the way that we work than just automation. And so what I'll talk about by contrast is when you think of social software, one way of defining it is software that adapts to its environment rather than requiring the environment to adapt to it, right? It's something where the properties of the system emerge from the bottom up, where you're trying to augment human capabilities. Rather than to try to automate people out of the process, which is something that I'm sure if you've worked in a large company, you might have experienced. There's something very different in that also. It's software that lets users share control of the software itself, right? When you have a group of people editing a wiki page, there are a lot of features that don't actually exist in the software and are instead left in the minds of the group. So for example, when you use, Wikipedia doesn't have a feature to detect vandalism or detect spam, right? Of course, it's very easy to create algorithms that would detect something that might be spam and block it out. But the odds of that algorithm being wrong are actually pretty significant. And so it's quite purposeful with Wikipedia that the feature to detect spam is a group of people, right? Of a lot of people paying attention to the same thing. Just like in open source software, when you have enough eyeballs on the problem, all bugs are shallow. They're easy to detect, right? And so what you'll find is actually within wikis and in social software, a lot of properties that are very similar to the way that open source software and open source projects work. So I tried to help in defining social software back in 2002, back when we started Social Text, the wiki company, as adapting to its environment rather than requiring its environment to adapt to it. And it's interesting because, by contrast, with traditional enterprise software, look at an enterprise, right? A very large company as a complex adaptive system, right? The whole goal was, for enterprise software, was to take all that complexity that existed in the social network and bake it down into the software in ways that it wouldn't change. And I don't think that actually reflects the way that enterprises actually work. And what we have with social software is something slightly different. We're keeping the complexity in the social network where it belongs and letting people make decisions together and having tools that are very, very simple, right? And by doing that, you get very emergent properties. So when you see, for example, on, how many of you have seen the website Digg, D-I-G-G maybe, right? So in that, it's pretty interesting because in Dig, you get these emergent properties of things bubbling up. Some things are more dug than others, right? And the thing is that the software is actually pretty simple. It's just a bunch of people making one-click actions. And out of that, you get some kind of collective intelligence, is what people would call it. So if you think about, let's step back and think about networks, right? Following the very good panel that we had earlier. One way to look at a network is this old way of broadcast. That's something where you could say the value of the network is the number of subscribers. This is, in other words, the value is n, according to Sarnoff's law. That's one way of looking at a network, and the way that, unfortunately, most institutions look at things. The value is the number of people subscribing to what I'm publishing. Another view of it is what you could call Metcalfe's law, where the value of the network is n squared, right? We're valuing the different nodes and all the different combinations between the different nodes in the network. There's also something called Reed's law of group forming, where the value of the network is not the number of subscribers or the value or the number of nodes, and each node can both subscribe and publish, but the value is in groups, right? The value in Reed's law of group forming of networks is 2 to the nth, and I'll illustrate this in a second. But what's interesting is that it's all the possible combinations of members in different groups with members in other groups. Now, one thing that's really interesting, I think, about social software is we support what's called easy group forming. It's very easy, or let's put it this way. Some of the most revolutionary things that have happened to us over the last 5 years is that today, anybody has the ability to publish to a global audience for near zero cost. We've gotten that through blogging, and that's incredibly transformative. But also another thing is that the cost for forming a group is falling to zero out on the public internet. And so what's interesting about that is anybody at this time can form a new group and take collective action at almost zero cost. Anybody who exhibits that kind of leadership and has some literacy around the tools. And I think that's incredibly transformative, not just for the way that we live our daily life. Let's say if we want to form a new group to take collective action against some kind of consumer product that is damaging to our environment, for example. Or we want to form a new group to get things done inside the enterprise. Or we want to form a new group, let's say, to engage politics on an issue where before that group would be very hard to discover and find. Another place where costs are falling near to zero is it's getting easier and easier to find expertise, right? To find people that may have common interests, right? And so it's interesting, the most interesting thing, and I say the word interesting a lot when I talk, but is that you will find it's easier for you to discover your own power, to discover the power of working with other people, to discover people to work with, than it ever has been before. And we engage with different groups in different ways. So this is a really silly blog post image that I wrote a long time ago. If you Google the title, then you'll find it and probably find a better explanation than what I'm about to give. So, but what's interesting is that around us, we participate in all kinds of different groups, right? And we actually have limits to the scales of the groups that we can participate. If I was to be really morbid and to ask you to write a list of the people that you would be deeply disaffected by if they died, that number would max out at about 12, right? We can only have so many deep, strong ties, strong relationships in our lifetimes, right? At any one moment in our lifetimes. So that number maxes out at about 12. My other favorite number is 150, right? So Robin Dunbar did this research in 2 ways, both at studying the size of our mental capacity and also the average size of tribes that would form in very primitive societies. She was an anthropologist, or he was an anthropologist, I should say. What's interesting is at about 150 people, we max out in the ability to be able to track 150 people and how they relate to each other, right? That's the size of a tribe that we kind of keep in our brain at any moment in time. This is a absolute constraint, We can't track more than 150 relationships at any one time. We do have new tools that let us remember people that we've met before and put them into the 150 very quickly, and to discover new people to put in and out of the 150. But so what's interesting is that then you also have the scale of thousands, right? Complete strangers. And in that case, I may be able to publish to billions of people, right, in kind of a Sarnoff's law model, but I'm not actually going to engage in them. And so the only reason me throwing this up here is I think it's important for you to think a tiny bit about, as we're making this different kinds of software, we support very different group sizes, and different group sizes that have different goals for us to support. Let's talk again a tiny bit about the enterprise, and less abstractly. So what's interesting is that Andrew McAfee is a professor at Harvard Business School and was monitoring a deployment of social text at a bank in London, where in this bank he had wikis and blogs and RSS, and he was trying to describe something, a different kind of information system than what he saw before. What he did was to coin the term Enterprise 2.0 and define it as free-form social software adapted for enterprise use. So let me help unpack that and get a better understanding. So by free-form, what he meant is it's unstructured, right? When you're using Wiki, you're not filling in forms, clicking a button, and going to the next step, right? It's at the beginning, you know, a wiki is essentially like the best collaboration tool ever invented, paper, right? You can do all kinds of things with paper. You can draw lines on it and maybe make grid paper. You can even fold it up and throw it in, turn it into an airplane, right? A paper airplane. And the beauty is that flexibility. You can, with paper or a wiki, you can go in any direction you like. But the point is that it doesn't have to be defined beforehand, right? How many of you have had to use Lotus Notes just to illustrate this, right? Maybe a couple. If any of the people who've used Lotus Notes would like to say they like it, please stand up, right? Or you've enjoyed using it, right? Probably not, and the reason is the amount of structure inherent in that as a collaboration tool. Filling in a form and clicking a button to go to the next step that was predefined by an expert outside the context of doing your work doesn't feel very liberating, right? So what's interesting though is that with a wiki, you can just start working, right? You just start writing and creating links, maybe adding tags to pages. The structure of the application emerges as a byproduct of using this, right? And maybe I should give you actually a real example from one of our customers to help illustrate this. So, for example, at Dell, a big computer manufacturer, they have a huge call center of about 5,000 people spread all over the world, right? They had this structured knowledge base that they were turning to answer all kinds of questions. The problem was people stopped turning to it, and then a lot of people just simply stopped contributing to it, right? The structure that was defined by the designers of the program became antiquated. So what happened was they started to create like 17 different point solutions around this structured knowledge base for people to solve their problem and be able to go home and, you know, when they were done with their work. We deployed a social text wiki, and in the first month, all we did was focus with a real small core group on training how to use the tool, which isn't that hard, but mostly on getting social agreement on how to use the tool. Because technology has no value unless the group of people using it agree to use it in a similar way. By the second month, we got it up to 1,000 users, including Michael Dell. And the third month, we had this very vibrant wiki with thousands of pages. 99% of those pages had tags. So there was a structure emerging for this knowledge base by using it. The net result is we decreased the average time spent answering calls, or average call time, by 10 to 20%. Now multiply that by 5,000 people, that's the biggest value proposition that anyone's realized in social software yet, right? But think for a moment about what that is, right? A call center is a group of people solving problems, right? They answer the phone and they do a query to try to find an answer, right? What they'll do is they'll first check the traditional structured knowledge base for the known answers to the known problems, right? And then if that isn't there, they'll turn to the wiki. If they can find an answer, fantastic. If the answer is out of date, what do? They edit the page and update it. If the answer doesn't exist, they click new page and create one. It's just writing down answers and creating a structure and the way that different problems relate to each other through links. It's a lot simpler than the solution that they were dealing with before and more usable. The funny thing is that I used to say that in 5 years of social text, we've never had an incident of a single employee doing something bad in a wiki. Well, in the Dell wiki, we actually did. There was a guy in India who started to create a section about the wiki, or in the wiki, about how to support Macintosh computers. That didn't go over very well in Dell, and so he got in trouble for it. But that's about the worst thing that I've ever heard in terms of human behavior. We tend to self-regulate, actually. So what's interesting is that another way of describing this Enterprise 2.0 thing is tools that offer very simple affordances of search, linking, authoring, tagging, extensions, and signals. So all of those are self-explanatory with the exception of extensions, I think, which is, think about Amazon recommendations, right? If you liked this page, you might like this other one, right? But beyond that, signals stands for RSS feeds. Authoring is writing, tagging is tagging, and I think there's a decent amount of literacy around it. But this, with these very simple affordances, you get the ability to create very rich repositories for knowledge, very simple ways of collaborating with each other without a tool that's actually getting in your way. And I think that's the most important thing. So now I'm going to go very abstractly with you, and hopefully this will be fun, so bear with me. But if you think about all of what is happening in Web 2.0, you'll see one pattern emerge, which is sharing control to create value. The value in YouTube, for example, is not created by Google or the people who were running the company before they bought them. The value is created by the users themselves, right? If you look at Wikipedia, the value is created by the users. And even users is not a very good term to describe what they do. In Wikipedia, there's a tremendous amount of control that is shared by users to moderate, to refactor, to create content, to restructure content, right? And actually, the more that you are open and the more that you share, the more value is created. I'll give you a weird example. Firefox is a tremendously valuable organization, but the vast majority of its software, of course, is created by its community. Of course, it's found a way to monetize all that attention and value through selling the placement of the little search bar in the top right of the Firefox web browser, right? But what's interesting is that model, whether it be Wikipedia or whether it be Firefox, creates much more valuable communities, but the owner of that community doesn't necessarily get the same financial return. You may have heard of Craigslist, which is a web-based classified advertising site, right? What's interesting about Craigslist is all the value is created by the users of the software, right? But they also created this fantastic web-based alternative to classified advertising. The San Francisco Bay Area classified advertising market, and this is about 3 years ago, used to be worth, I believe it's $80 million. And that was absolutely decimated. The market completely disappeared because of this kind of online competition. At that same year, Craigslist was only generating $8 million in revenue. So there was a 10-to-1 destruction of value in terms of what was monetized. But I would suggest that maybe you might have gotten a 10-fold increase in the value for users themselves, partially just by being open and giving them a role. So the problem in general about being open is that we already have these existing structures, whether they be institutions or software that's codified knowledge. And as we look to find different models where we can share control over the edit button, we're actually able to evolve into entirely different business models. The biggest problem, I think, is that we have this big, deeply ingrained fear about this kind of change, right? For an enterprise, sharing control, let's say with its customers or its employees, is not its first instinct, right? Steven Weber, who's a really well-known professor and author on open source, described it as there's no buy versus build equation for making the decision to open yourself, let's say by licensing your intellectual property under a common license, right? So for example, Social Text a couple years ago made this decision to open source its software. I couldn't do any kind of equation to say what the return would be. It would be unknown, right? And we had to take a significant risk in opening ourselves up in that way. And I think those are the really hard decisions, I think, faced with that enterprises face when trying to figure out what to do about Web 2.0, right? So one part of this, though, is when it comes to open source, Yochai Benkler wrote this really wonderful book called The Wealth of Nations that's incredibly dense and hard to get through. And what he was describing it as is open source and Wikipedia, for example, work through commons-based peer production. In other words, there's three kinds of production. In markets, people produce according to price signals, right? If suddenly you can see the demand through the price signals, then you should produce. Within firms, we make contracts, right? You're going to work for my company, I'm going to pay you, here's the contract that structures what you're going to produce. But what's interesting is that in social networks, something else entirely drives people to produce, social signals. It may be the perception of, if I do this thing, I'll get rewarded from my peers with a little bit of reputation, right? Whether it be explicit or implicit reputation. And so what's interesting is that what we're doing with social software is experimenting with different ways of driving production. In an enterprise, for example, you know how when you work for a company, you'll have a job description? One study found that only 30% of a given employee's skills actually match up with that job description. The other 70% of their skills go completely unused, right? So we have all kinds of skills and we have all kinds of expertise that the structure of the firm doesn't allow us to contribute. And what's funny is that when you start making processes more transparent and more participatory, people will volunteer knowledge and expertise if for no other reason than to get some kind of social benefit inside the enterprise. That's an incredibly powerful thing to tap into, not just inside your enterprise, but outside your enterprise. So what's happening with Dell, the example I gave you before, that's really interesting is they're asking the right questions now, that they have these 5,000 call center reps using a real dynamic wiki knowledge base. They're saying, why just have the call center reps be the only people who have access to read this, or maybe to edit this, right? Why not have all 50,000 of our employees? Even still, they could do things like another customer of ours, MicroStrategy did, who went through the same process, starting on the inside and gradually opening up. What they ended up doing was making a public wiki knowledge base that had all kinds of documentation. Now the benefit there is not just that people might search and browse through the wiki to find answers instead of calling in the call center, which they view as expensive. But what they might actually be able to do is volunteer knowledge, because the people who know the most about your products are not the people on your payroll, right? This is almost an iceberg you have to think of, right? We can only see the tip. According to the Consortium of Service Innovation, only 1% of the total product knowledge that exists from your customers actually gets assimilated. Only 10% of the total product knowledge actually reaches into the call center, right? 70% of the knowledge about your product, of the way that people are using it, the experiences that they have, are things that firms never, well, you probably know too much about Macs. So, but when your Mac is broken, do you call to the Apple support rep? No. You probably reach out to like Matt Maurer or somebody who knows a lot about something, right? We have our informal social networks, and we keep in our minds, within that 150 people, we're pretty good at remembering who's really good at this problem or that problem, who's, you know, the diva of a given solution, right? So you're going to go and you'll find these different kinds of people, and you'll tap into that informal network, right? This is why, and it's something that I think you guys get really well, given by the lengths of your lunches and dinners and stuff like that. Socialization is really important, right? The guy you met at the company picnic, who happens to be an expert on a Macintosh, you'll remember when you've got a problem and you're going to ping him to solve the problem. You're not going to go to the IT support desk. So if we can take that social fabric where work actually gets done and make it more transparent, it's incredibly powerful. So here's the interesting thing. Think about it this way. Software is really good at automating business processes, right? When we know what the problem is and we can be prescriptive about what steps we take to address that problem. But when you have what's called an exception to a business process, something goes wrong, what's happened is that process is out of date because there's been a change in the environment. And we haven't really had tools. So let's say you're at work and you're in charge of doing something like sending out invoices. And there's some kind of breakdown in that process. What do? Right? You probably tap that same informal network that's inside the enterprise to solve the problem, to handle the exception. And the way you do it today is you probably send out a bunch of email, right? Unfortunately, email is not really a productive tool for us anymore. Maybe 20% of email is productive. 30% of email is what's called occupational spam. It's when you CC, blind CC, reply to all. You're using email as a broadcast medium, right? And email, worse, is private. There's no group memory in email, right? So if the problem has been solved before, it's very hard to discover how it was solved. But what's interesting is that I believe when you're looking at how you solve problems together, you can make that exception handling more transparent, and then you can share control, not of, here's the change that happens inside an organization. We're not going to change having bosses or not having bosses, or having a small few people making the really big decisions, right? But what we are going to change is the information flow around those decisions, and the amount of information that's transparent that holds a lot of those decisions in check, right? And I think that's kind of a powerful thing, where, let me talk about, actually, this is a little bit too abstract, but let me have some more fun with this. So, how many of you have seen this before? A couple. How many of you have bought the Radiohead album? Oh, wait. Okay. So Radiohead, right, this big music label, took their latest album and made it available out there on the internet, right? That's not that big a deal. Anybody can go and buy it. But the funny thing about it was they actually made the album available at any price you like. You can go today to the In Rainbow's site and you can download it. And if you want, what you can do is you can put 0, right, for the amount of pounds that you would pay. But let me take a quick poll of the people who bought the Radiohead album. Maybe go around, yell out how many pounds you paid. 4, 10, 10, 5, $9.99. Did anybody pay 0? 0? That's fine. I mean, look at how it all adds up, right? They made a boatload of money. They won't share the figures off of it, right? When given the choice, they had the opportunity. People were, let's put it this way. Music is this wonderfully powerful thing, right? Something that we have this different kind of emotional connection to. And recognizing a simple fact out of only 1 out of 10 CDs are actually paid for anyway, right? We know that the pirating and the sharing and things are going on. I don't know why the recording industry is resisting all this, of course, right? But what's interesting is that what they were recognizing is that music is in effect a social good. And this creative work would be rewarded by people when people are given the chance to make the decision, when the control over pricing was handed over to the users. And I think when you're thinking about these decisions about Web 2.0 and what to do, and how can I open my business model up, this is a very extreme example of how to do it. The ultimate gesture of sharing control is sharing control over price, right? And I've actually, one of the weird experiments that I've done in like different audiences before is I've said, okay, anybody can have a wiki for any price. You name your own price. And I swear to God, every single time that I'm not doing that right now, but every time I've done that, the results have been absolutely fantastic, right? When you can let go of enough control to share that decision. So this is just a weird example that I like to give of the fact that markets are social, right? The fact is that what makes commerce go through is active conversations. The way that people talk about things, retain relationships, and the people that you end up forming relationships with, those folks are even going to extend you credit, even the financial kind of credit, that actually makes markets work. So here's an interesting thing for you to do. Think about a given business process that you're involved in at a company and try to redesign it using social software by asking two really weird questions. What would happen if we made this process more transparent? What would happen if we made this process more participatory? So what's interesting is that if you can do that, especially outside your firewall, you end up gaining a significantly different kind of business model and creating much larger overall value. What I find interesting is, so I'll give you a quick example. At SAP is one of our customers, right? A software company that is exactly the opposite of us. But so what we did with them, though, is they had a group of 10 people that were in charge of competitive intelligence, mostly doing a bunch of things to figure out what Oracle's up to. Those 10 people worked essentially as private investigators, right? They would go off, gather a little bit of intelligence here and there, and they'd produce a research report that would get sent around the organization. What we did was redesign their process. First, we gave them the comfort level of letting them, as they're making this sausage, and it wasn't really pretty, to make all of their work transparent by making the wiki viewable by anybody inside the company, right? So they could see what these folks are actually up to. The other thing, though, is that after they gained some comfort about that, is they changed to make it participatory. They made it so anybody who had any kind of competitive intelligence, competitive insight, let's say they were at a trade show and heard something that Oracle said, were able to add that to the wiki, and they could assimilate that very simply and easily. They also changed the way that they were reporting from this manufacturing process to produce a big, 10-page PDF that they'd give to somebody, to little tiny updates by blog. And then also, some of the things that didn't make it into the report were available for reuse and discovery by other people, right? So I really challenge you to try to think about, of all the different processes that are around you, how could you redefine them in that way? So this is a little slide I think Paolo showed earlier or something like that, that comes from a blog post. And it's a healthy way, it helps me at least, explain some of the nonsense that I've been talking about. So if you think about it, we all participate in all kinds of different communities, right? But we're not going to participate in equal levels with every single community. Some of them I'm going to want to be a lot more engaged in. Some of them I'm going to be a lot more passive, right? Your average social software site has a 10-to-1 ratio of lurkers to active participants, right? Only 10% of the people in a given community might be really active. But so what's interesting is that you end up with this power law distribution of how much engagement people would have in a given community. So way over here, what's interesting is that, so with Wikipedia, 500 people, and this was about 2 years ago on my stats, 500 people account for 50% of the edits, which is just 0.5% of the population. 750 people account for 75% of the edits, which is just 0.75% of the entire Wikipedia registered user population. In other words, way over here, there's a whole bunch of people that are doing a lot of edits, right? A lot of the heavy lifting, right? But the vast, vast majority of users of Wikipedia are actually, put your hands up if you read Wikipedia, right? Excellent. Keep your hand up if you've made one edit, right? Numbers are trailing down. Keep your hands up if you've made more than 5 edits. Numbers are trailing off. Keep your hand up if you consider yourself part of the core of the community, right? We don't have any hardcore Wikipedians here, but so you get my point. This wonderful resource, thanks to the volunteer efforts of a dedicated few, but being open for everybody else to make that one contribution, right? Now, hopefully that one edit that you made in Wikipedia, you were adding value rather than sucking value. It's entirely possible either way. And what's interesting is that what that allows us to do is I might be the world's best domain expert on a given topic, and I might make that one contribution, and they've got a business model, a model that has the affordance for that knowledge to be assimilated, okay? So there's different ways when building social software of allowing lower threshold use, from reading to maybe a one-click digging-like action, to tools that people might use for moderating, right, or managing the community itself. And what's interesting is that there's different kinds of intelligence at play here. On Dig, when people are favoriting things, right, you could have what's called collective intelligence. I don't even know necessarily if it should be called intelligence, because the difference is when people are clicking that button, they're doing so without knowing each other, without having any context or conversation between them, right? But what emerges out of Wikipedia's use is people actually not acting as strangers, and all of the different contributions, interactions being interdependent, right? And out of that, I think, emerges a different kind of intelligence, a collaborative intelligence, right? So there's a difference when you have mass collaboration is extremely powerful, but there's two different general forms. One is collective intelligence, where the mass doesn't know each other. Like if I put a jar of jelly beans up here and asked you guys to guess how many are in there, if I took the average, it'd probably be really close to the number of beans in a jar, right? But if I gave you guys the opportunity to talk about it, and besides sending in this anonymous vote, I would get a very different form of guess that might even be better. And so that's something kind of interesting. The point, again, though, is that in different communities, we're going to have different kinds of engagement. And inside an enterprise, I'm going to have some things like a project that I am the project lead of that I'm going to be highly engaged in. And I'm going to need different kinds of tools to do a lot of heavy lifting in. And a lot of others, I'm going to be passive free riders off of other projects. And maybe I'm just reading to kind of stay informed, or maybe I'm adding value just by a tiny comment here or there, given my expertise and my context. So what's interesting is that if you think about it, the Encyclopedia Britannica, as a business, only had the core, right? They had paid people working through an editorial process with some kind of accreditation of their expertise. And what's interesting is that there is this whole other, side. There's this entirely different side that a traditional business like Encyclopedia Britannica could have opened itself into. And if so, they could end up with a business model that might end up being similar to what Wikipedia is. So the point is that actually there's an opportunity, I think, for every business to explore what is this periphery, this outside that they could open themselves to, and how. The hard part, again, right, is that if you want to get the benefits of sharing control and being open, you actually have to move towards transparency. This is something that, again, is not part of the instinct, but there's little baby steps that you can take, right? In the same way with that Dell example, began with some level of transparency in a group, in a call center, that was known and trusted first, to be able to experiment to making that information more and more public, more and more available, right? So what's interesting, and how much time do I have here, by the way? About 5 minutes? Perfect. So there are all kinds of different tools that I think excel in different areas of how much people are going to participate in. And actually, this spectrum could be a lot richer. And I really would encourage those who are in the audience as entrepreneurs to try to explore what are ways not only that I could fill in a niche that's not being met, but how can I end up providing the affordances in the software that I would create to let people participate at the thresholds that they would like, right? And one small example here, I actually have a screenshot. It's a miracle, and it is our software. So this is Epitaph, which is a record label based in Los Angeles. And it's interesting how they're running their entire company on the wiki, essentially. And so it's partially, and it's probably not legible, and you can't really see it, but it is their actual wiki. What they're doing is not just using it internally within the firm, but all these different projects that they have are actually shared with the band, right? The band and all the people who work with the band's manager, that kind of thing. But what's interesting is that what these guys are telling us is, at first, we were using this as a way to communicate to a band what the schedule is, right? You guys are going to go over here, then you're going to go to this hotel room, probably break the hotel room, and then you're going to go and do this show or something like that. But the insight that they were getting from just providing getting the feedback loop that didn't exist, right? They really think, you can imagine how Epitaph feels these days with things like the Radiohead In Rainbows thing happening without any album. And so how are they trying to respond to the disruption? Is they're being open and transparent about the way that they're working with their end customers, and they're allowing their end customers, these bands, to, well actually those aren't their end customers, to participate and restructuring the way that they're promoting them, right? And so the point is that they're using these tools of social software to deepen the relationship with the people that matter almost the most to them, right? Their clients. So I want to wrap up and have like a couple questions real quick, so I'm going real fast. But in summary, social software is something that I think is going to allow us to be a little bit more human, right? It's going to recognize that people are actually better at certain decisions than programmers who've created an algorithm about the decision outside the context of when the decision needs to be made. We also have an opportunity, I think, to augment people's capability rather than automating them out of the process itself. And there are certain kinds of decisions, or let's put it this way, some of the very best software is not going to be the software that has this laundry list of features, but is consciously not developing certain features because they actually end up getting in people's way. So I'm going to wrap up real quick because I'd rather have a little bit of a conversation, because the gist of it really is that, you know, we should be having software that's a lot more like the dinner conversations and lunch conversations that we're having, because that's where we're actually passing knowledge around. That's where we're getting to know different people and what kind of expertise they have and who to tap for the right decisions or right bits of information at the right time. So thank you. Any questions, please? Please. Anyone? Please. About what? Here, I'll let the mic come to you, if you don't mind.
What do you think about the project Boeing, with which you share your CPU for make calcul for project about natural environment, something like that?
So I'm not sure I know the project you're talking about. You mean like cloud computing, Amazon EC2, or?
Well, by installing this program, you share your free CPU you're not using while you're connecting the internet to and lead it for making calculus for
Got it.
Scientific research.
So I think it's fantastic. Like one of my prior lives is I ran this bandwidth trading company, right? And Enron was our biggest customer, and we were $1 billion market cap, and we only had $60,000 in revenue, and let's hope the bubble comes back one day. But what's interesting was as we were trading telecommunications capacity, you get to understand, you know, what is peak use in the middle of the day and what is not, right? And we have all kinds of extra spare cycles if we can just find ways to share, right? So I think they're fantastic. I think what would be interesting is rethinking those kinds of shared grid computing models with something that might be more social, right? So how could I have social interaction, as an just hypothetical, that would be talking about what causes to devote extra computing cycles to, right? So how can we overlay that with conversation to help direct attention and resources? Might be interesting. Please.
Yes, Gaspar Torriero. My question is, you said any company can open up.
Yes.
Do you believe that?
I actually do. It's funny, in even the most control-oriented organizations, you see social software adoption taking off. So within the CIA, they have Intellipedia, right? Now you would imagine within the CIA, where it's all about compartmentalized information and certain people are super experts and a lot of secret and layered information, all they ended up having to do was adapt the software slightly to the environment and have different Intellipedias for different classifications of security, right? And it's taken off like absolute wildfire, right? obviously certain industries, certain companies that are less control oriented, that already have practices like 360-degree reviews or a culture of open critique and dialogue and conversation. Obviously, certain kinds of companies are going to take to this kind of software faster, right? But I do think that those who don't will be at some level of competitive disadvantage. And that will be the thing that ends up driving their adoption. Or there's the other bottom-up argument, which is, well, a lot of these tools, like on our hosted service, you can get social text for free for up to 5 users, right? That kind of adoption is going to happen from the bottom up, you know, without the involvement of the IT department or the CEO, right? Or somebody could grab the open source version, deploy it under their desk in a server, and so you'll have some level of adoption. So many cases when we come into a large enterprise, they've already got about 10 different wikis that have emerged from the bottom up, and we come in at the right time when the organization's saying, hey, there's something serious here. Maybe we should actually support it, right? So different things like that. Yeah. Any other question? Yes.
Hi. I'm working actually for a public council, and the social text, Wikipedia and whatever would be really appropriate for council and public administration, I think. If you be in charge of a council or a public firm, how would you implement the social text?
Right.
What would you do to change your nature?
Right. And so, you know how I was talking about being more transparent and participatory? Wouldn't it be great if government was like that, right? I'll give you an example. So we have, in the state of Utah in the United States, the guy who's the House Rules Chairman, who decides in the legislature what bills are voted upon, opened up his process, right? And what he did was, at Politicopia, you have a wiki that has the text of the bill, and then you have a page that's called pro and a page that's called con, and it enabled citizens to build different arguments for and against the bill, right? The net result of that is he credits it with passing this bill that he was trying to get passed for 6 years, because he was able to point to this public debate by the citizenry in which they unearthed and discovered some facts, an economic argument for why school vouchers is a good thing, right? So the point is that actually the first step is do your work in a way that's viewable by others, right? Because when you're dealing with public administration, it's hard for the citizenry to understand where does their tax money go? How hard is civil service and the actual work that you do? And then the second point is, I think that in between when people vote and when they pay their taxes, citizens actually would like to engage and do things for and with their government, right? So you can find ways of, whether it be, for example, a guy on my board of advisors was used to work at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. And what he did was he was the first person to put an email address on the public net for any government institution, which of course was completely overloaded, right? The second that that happened, right? What I think you'll find is people will love to give feedback around civil service, and it's just a question of whether you're open for it. Right? Cool. Do we have time for more? No more time. Okay. Yeah. Cool. But thank you very much. This has been fun.